Hello and welcome to another adventure in Australian literature, and we're back this week with another Patrick White. Big one. Always fun when we do White. But before we start, check out our shop. It's the best way to support us. There are books, there are writing services, all sorts of things on our shop. Also, there's our Redbubble shop where there are lots and lots of different designs and other things that, we have a really nice selection of Halloween goodies at the moment. If you like creepy cute, there are some Halloween things up. So that's that. Remember also, if you like these videos, please like them, please subscribe. It really helps the channel. Watching them to the end really helps the channel. So thank you. Now for our book, we have a Patrick White, and it looks like we're going through into the 60s now. So we've done The Tree of Man, we've done Voss. I may redo Voss. I'm not 100% happy with Voss, so there might be an update on the Voss one. But this time we are doing Riders in the Chariot. This is Patrick White's 6th novel, his 3rd since returning to Australia. His 4th since returning, because Aunt's Story is his 1st one since returning to Australia, but his 4th big Australian novel. And so what is this? It's 1961 this is published, and Riders in the Chariot is the first of the Sarsaparilla novels. So let me explain what Sarsaparilla is. Sarsaparilla is Patrick White's invented town. It's on the outskirts of a large city, probably Sydney. He was at the time he was living in Castle Hill, and he more or less based Sarsaparilla on Castle Hill. He had, when he wrote his first novel, he had set it in a real place, a real community, and then had refused allowing that to be published or reprinted because he was a bit afraid that people who actually knew him would sort of recognize themselves. So what he did, his solution to this, is to invent Sarsaparilla. Sarsaparilla is a town on the outskirts of the city. Suburbia is encroaching on Sarsaparilla, but it's former farmland. So there are still remnants of its former glories as farmland and with pastoralists. So Miss Hare, in her crumbling mansion in this, is a descendant of one of those pastoralists from when Sarsaparilla was just a country town right out in the middle of nowhere. So that's what Sarsaparilla is. He will use Sarsaparilla again and again and again. There's actually a series of plays that are set in Sarsaparilla, and The Solid Mandala is another Sarsaparilla book. I can't remember if there are any others, but I think there are some short stories that are set in Sarsaparilla. He did use Sarsaparilla a lot. So Miss Hare is the first character we meet. Miss Hare is an elderly lady. There are 4 riders in the chariot. The chariot refers to a passage out of Ezekiel with the 4 riders in the chariot. So she's our first rider, and all 4 riders represent different elements of spirituality. She is an elemental pagan spirituality. She is at one with nature. She lives in this crumbling mansion. She's no longer able to fully look after her house or herself as well as she had been, and she is forced to bring in a housekeeper, Mrs. Jolly. Mrs. Jolly is one of our villains. Mrs. Jolly is convention. Mrs. Jolly is conformity. Mrs. Jolly does not approve of Miss Hare at all. And Mrs. Jolly has a great friend, Mrs. Flack. Mrs. Flack has a son called Blue. All 3 of these are villains in this book. All three of these characters are part of conformity, convention, and the cruelty that can go along with that. So Mrs. Jolly comes into conflict with Miss Hare. So we have Miss Hare and Miss Jolly. The next rider in the Chariot I think the next one that we meet, I'm not sure I can't remember exactly which order that we meet, but the next one I'm going to talk about is Mrs. Godbod. She is, in White's words, an evangelical laundress. She is a woman who has come to Australia from England. She is a evangelical Christian, though that term doesn't have the same connotations in White's day as it does today. So she's not attached to one of the formal Christian churches, is what he's talking about. She's representing Christianity. She is the one who brings all these people together. She has come from England. She's gone into service. She's left England of her own accord, completely independently after her family has died, and come over here, where she has met her husband, who was the Iceman. Literally, he brought ice for the icebox. And she has several children. She and her husband have her husband's a brute. Her husband is a brute, and she has an unhappy marriage with him. The third rider in the Chariot is Mordecai Himmelfarb. Mordecai Himmelfarb is what, in this period, the 50s, 60s, he is a new Australian. He is a post-war migrant. He is a German intellectual who had a university career in Germany before the war, and who is also a Jewish mystic. So he is a very orthodox, very spiritual Jewish man. He has lost his wife in the Holocaust. He has survived the Holocaust, and he has come to Australia. He works in the bicycle factory in Barronugly. Barronugly is one of the terms that White invented. It's a lot of Australian place names have Indigenous names. So this is how we get a name like Katoomba, or Wollongong, or any number, Wagga Wagga, Dubbo. Indigenous names. Barronugly is a imitation of these names, not in any racist way, but he's describing the place. It's barren and ugly. It's called Barronugly. Generally, given its proximity to Sarsaparilla and given Sarsaparilla's existence as Castle Hill, it's Parramatta, which again is another one of those names. They work in Parramatta. Parramatta in the 60s, 50s and 60s was very different to Parramatta today. Parramatta today is almost an extension of Sydney. But then it was a lot more industry was around Parramatta. It was a pretty ugly, icky, sort of not much of a place. So Barronugly. So that's Himmelfarb Mordecai. He's the third rider. His Jewishness. And the fourth rider in the Chariot is quite different. Fourth rider is Alf Dubbo. Alf Dubbo is an Indigenous man, a member of the stolen generations. He's been taken from his Indigenous mother and taken to live with this reverend and his wife or sister, I can't quite remember. Anyway, there he discovers his love and skill as a painter. Alf Dubbo is Indigenous, he's a painter, and he's gay. He also works at the Barron Ugly Bicycle Factory with Mordecai Himmelfarb. So those are our riders. Alf Dubbo is James Baldwin talked, there's a brilliant documentary called I Am Not Your Negro, in which James Baldwin talks about bearing witness as to the civil rights movement rather than being an active participant. Alf Dubbo, as the artist, is the one who bears witness to what is happening, and that is what earns him the place in the Chariot. It's not just his spirituality, it's not just his indigenous nature, it's that he is the witness bearer, he is the artist. So these four outcasts form the riders in the Chariot. They form, as with everything with White, the spiritual core of the novel. This is probably, definitely, White's most savage indictment against the great Australian ugliness. And these four riders in the Chariot, for various different reasons, are his prophets, his individuals who are holding a mirror up to the great Australian ugliness that it does not like to see, therefore they are outcasts. They are all outcasts for different reasons. Miss Hare is eccentric, she is a spinster, she is non-conforming religiously. Miss Godbod, who, although Christian, is an evangelical Christian, so a more spontaneous, inspired Christianity than Orthodox Christianity as typified by the churches. So she is also an outcast. Mordecai Himmelfarb is a New Australian. He is religiously different. He is culturally different. This is a difference. He is not playing the game in the way that the government and society is expecting, the assimilate game. You come here, you have to be exactly like us. He's not playing that game. And finally, Alf Dubbo is othered. He is Indigenous in Australia, and he is othered by white Australia because he is Indigenous. He is no less Australian than anyone else. But this is Australia before 67. He is a man whose life is under the control of the state government rather than the federal government. Rules are made differently for him. He is othered by, not just by society, but he is literally othered by the government. He is also othered because he is gay, he is an artist, and he's an alcoholic. The alcoholism is understandable given the ostracism from every other part of society. Now, these four are holding a mirror up to the great Australian ugliness. White had written an essay on the great Australian ugliness not long before this one, between Voss and this book. He'd written an essay on that. That's the famous essay where he talks about Australians being an unthinking people. He was talking about this in the late 50s, the early 60s. In 1964, Donald Horne will publish his The Lucky Country, a book that is perennially misunderstood in this country. Oh, we're the lucky country, the lucky country. No, his concept of why we're the lucky country is he described Australia as a second-rate people who are blessed by the luck of the resources of their country, the climate, and things outside of their control, and therefore have not taken taken the time or the effort to be better. They're skating along. Now, the villains of this story are Mrs. Flack, Mrs. Jolly, and Blue. Blue is the biggest, nastiest, most vicious of them. And Blue and 7 of his friends win the lottery towards the end of the novel. They have been tormenting Himmelfarb and Alf Dubbo at work. They work at the bicycle factory. They've been tormenting them. And at Easter, they decide to mock crucify Mordecai Himmelfarb. So, and this viciousness that comes, why? Where does it come from? Why is it there? Blue doesn't know. He just knows that when he sees something different, it makes him feel bad. It makes him feel inadequate. So although Mordecai Himmelfarb has chosen to work in a manual labour job because after the Holocaust he has lost his faith in the intellectual pursuits, because intellectual pursuits did not save us, he is then again targeted. He's again targeted by the same ignorance, the same cruelty, the same mob rule that he was targeted in Germany with. Just because Blue doesn't wear a uniform and isn't following a government instruction doesn't make him any different to the mobs that ran through German streets at Kristallnacht. It doesn't make him any different to people who persecuted the Jews of Europe. But this is laughed off as a prank. It's laughed off as a prank. And this is the ugliness, this emptiness of spirituality, the lack of spiritual, the lack of. White isn't interested in a particular organised religion. White was never particularly an adherent, like a major adherent of organised religion, but he was a believer in the importance of a spiritual life, and that is vitally important to living a humane life. And the reason why he has 4 different sides, 4 different riders in the Chariot, is because he's not writing a spiritual polemic in terms of this side over this side. He's not dogmatic, but he is saying, look at the difference between these characters who have a spiritual life and these characters who are barren and ugly. These characters for whom the world means nothing more and life means nothing more than conforming and enforcing that conformity. Because the minute somebody breaks out of that conformity, it challenges your own conformity and you see the emptiness in your life. That is probably what Blue sees. That is what Mrs. Jolly sees. That is what Mrs. Flack see when they encounter these characters, the riders. They see the emptiness of their lives. They see the fact that their lives have no purpose, no meaning, and most importantly, no love. Alf Dubbo's great work. He has been trying all his life to create love. And this is what I mean about bearing witness. So while Miss Hare, Mrs. Godbod, and Mordecai are together at the end of the novel, we never see all 4 riders in the Chariot together. Alf Dubbo is looking in the window as Miss Hare and Mrs. Godbod tend to the dying Himmelfab, and he suddenly has his image of love, which he goes home and paints, because he is the one who bears witness. Which is another fact of this. It's not enough to sit silently by. You have to say something. It is not enough to just live. Live well is good, but to bear witness to living well is the role of the artist. Not everyone is the artist. There is only one artist in this book. There is one artist in the book, and he is the one who bears witness. That is the job of the artist. So White is saying it is the job not of the intellectual, but of the artist to bear witness. Mordecai is the intellectual, and he sees intellectualism has failed him, his people, Europe, the world. If intellectualism allows you to either not see the danger in front of you or to justify great wrongs, then yes, intellectualism has failed. But what doesn't fail, at least for White, which for a writer is going to be an obvious thing, what doesn't fail you is art. Art is not going to fail you. Art can bear witness to these things. Art can bear witness to things that you don't necessarily want to look at. Art can show you the stuff you don't want to see. And this is why Patrick White is so feared in this country. It's not the big words. It's not the length of the books. People in this country have been afraid of White showing us who we are. We're putting up a mirror and saying, this is who you are. And people don't like to always recognize who they are. Because what do you do if you look in the mirror and you're blue, or Mrs. Flack, or Mrs. Jolly? You might think, oh, I'd be Miss Hare. I'd be Mrs. Godbod, definitely. What happens if you look in the mirror and you're blue? That's terrifying. Australia has always had that undercurrent. It was more visible here at this point in Australian history. This is a period of time when we did not have a lot of universities. This is a period of time where there was no subsidizing university education in the way that the 1970s onward would have. Say what you like about HECS, it's still better than this. This was a period of time when large numbers of the Australian population did not finish high school. They did not finish 12 years, 13 years of schooling, so they did not do the HSC. That was only for people who wanted to go on to university. It was rare to find people who even had the 13 years of education. People generally left with a leaving certificate, or they left earlier. They left when they could they could legally leave, which was somewhere around 14-ish, 14 or 15. It was very, very young. So this is a world that is very different from today. Now, I don't wish to imply that one has to have a university education to avoid becoming blue, but an increase in the education of the population has seen the Great Australian Ugliness go underground somewhat. Though it does break out. It breaks out. We may not be exactly this world, But this world hasn't gone away. This world has not gone away. And that's a danger. That's why we don't like reading white. That is why just about every single academic text I found on this book is from overseas. We don't look at white because we don't want to see ourselves. It breaks out. The Cronulla riots, it broke out. It broke out in the 90s with Mabo. It broke out, unfortunately, it breaks out frequently surrounding Indigenous people, refugees. The Great Australian Ugliness is something that pits poor and disenfranchised people against one another. On the whole, it is something, it's the I've got mine, I'll pull the ladder up behind me. Now, we have looked at many books that show the good side of Australia, the good in Australian character. It's the world of the battlers in Kylie Tennant. It's the generosity of the Australians in They're a Weird Mob. But there's also this. It's not everything. It's not the full story. But you can't tell the full story if you don't include this. It is there, and it's what scares us away from white, because we know he wrote about it. We know he wrote about it, and we don't like to look at it. So, Riders in the Chariot. Also, this has the most deliciously, blackly funny end. And so it's not actually that's the thing about this book, is it's not completely gloomy. It is magnificently funny. It has these really dark passages, but it is magnificently funny. White is a master at that, but we're scared of him because he shows us stuff we don't want to see. So, Riders in the Chariot. Check it out. It is one of the more urban novels. I think there are definitely a couple of others that are also urban, but this is one of the first really urban novels. It is fascinating, funny, moving. Read it. And that's all from me. I will see you again next time with some more adventures in Australian literature. So, bye-bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.